Some time ago, popular atheist YouTuber Mindshift made a video called A Troll Lying About Truth. Christians Don't Own Truth. In that video, Mindshift responded to some comments he received. I'm going to be responding to each of the things that Mindshift said in his video in a multiple part series.
Let's move on. The fifth one is atheists cannot say that atheism is true. At this point, if you are the kind of Christian or troll or whatever this is supposed to be that still says things like this, it's a clear sign to all of us who have done the work of going through the arguments that you've never considered the other side's position ever, not even for a single second. Speaking like this is such obvious tribe thinking. You are just saying stupid things that have been said by people in an enclosed group that are so clearly and obviously explainable and better understood if you had any intention of caring what your opposition actually was saying or thinking. For the 916,000th time, atheism is not a worldview. Atheism is not claiming to be able to explain everything or to know everything. It is the position that I am not convinced that a God or gods exist. And in some cases, that can look more forthright. I am convinced that the Christian God does not exist. I'll make a positive statement there, but I have no idea if other gods exist. That's why I call myself an agnostic atheist. One has to do with knowledge, one has to do with belief. I don't believe in your God. That doesn't mean I know everything else all of a sudden. Take any individual proposition, and if you don't believe it, now let me apply this stupid question to you. I tell you, grasshoppers are eternal. You don't believe grasshoppers are eternal. So if we called that lack of belief a grasshopperism, and I said something like, a grasshopperists cannot say that a grasshopperism is true, you would look at me with the same confused face that I'm looking at you with now. Because here's the deal. I am not convinced this God exists. So yes, it is true that I am an atheist. It is true that I am not convinced of this God. But me not believing in it doesn't mean I have to show you how I could be wrong about that. Prove he exists in the first place. You're the one making the positive claim that he absolutely does.
One of the problems that I see with this type of thinking is that when someone makes I-centered statements, such as, I'm not convinced that this God exists, it sounds as if he's saying that the only things that can be true are the things about which he is convinced. Isn't that true of all of us? Don't we usually tend to believe things that we are convinced are true? I doubt that anyone is truly willing to accept that things can be true only if we become convinced that they are true. Any thinking person should be able to admit that there are things that are true about the world that we each experience that we do not yet understand or are not yet convinced about. Surely there are things about the world that we experience that we've not been convinced about, and that yet remain to be true even though we haven't been convinced about them. This is just simple deductive reasoning. If Mindshift is a former Christian, during the time that he was a Christian, wasn't he convinced that God was real? Ray Comfort did a brilliant analogy about this. He said, imagine a circle. The circle represents all the knowledge about everything there is in the whole world. And then he said, suppose you know an incredible 1% of all the knowledge that there is to know about everything in the world. He said that means that there's a whole other 99% of everything that you don't know about. He said within that 99% that you don't know about, isn't there room a God to exist? Well, an intellectually honest person would have to answer that question with a yes. That has to mean that agnosticism, rather than atheism, or agnostic atheism, is a more intellectually honest position for one to hold. If Mindshift says that not being convinced that a God exists makes one an atheist, I would have to respectfully disagree and point out that based on my example, it is more accurate to say that he is an agnostic as opposed to an atheist. To be convinced that the Christian God does not exist is different from knowing that the Christian God does not exist. As I've just explained, we can be convinced about things that are incorrect. We can be convinced into holding inaccurate beliefs. In fact, an atheist listening to this response by me should be able to tell that if they believe God does not exist, then they must think that I am convinced of something that is inaccurate, since I am convinced that God does in fact exist. As I've said before, we all have the same evidence from which to work. We all come to conclusions about how to interpret that evidence. My conclusion, based on the available evidence, is that there is enough available information about science, history, and literature, at least those three disciplines, to make a reasonable inference based on the evidence that a God does exist. Mindshift and anyone else can be free to disagree with that. If they do so by interpreting the evidence differently than I have interpreted the evidence. They do so with a degree of faith, just like I choose to believe in God with a degree of faith. The type of evidence that is available makes the type of proof to which Mindshift refers impossible for any theist to produce. The type of faith that produces a belief in God is an evidentially based faith. It is a cumulative, circumstantial case based on evidence. There will never be enough knowledge for the theist to say with 100% absolute certainty that God exists. Likewise, there will never be enough knowledge for the atheist to say with 100% absolute certainty that God does not exist. Both positions have an element of faith to them. An atheist has faith that God does not exist. A theist has faith that God does exist.